Can I ask you all to replicate that wonderful discussion a little bit about whether Britain had to fight World War II the way it did when it came into the war and that sort of thing? That was fascinating. I don't think Americans know this thesis.
Well, just to give you, do you want to give them the backstory?
Well, only that there are two books.
Yeah.
One just published, one about to be published, Human Smoke by
Yes.
Nicholson Baker.
and Churchill, Hitler and the Unnecessary War, which Pat Buchanan will be publishing in May. And it was by coincidence we found that he was reading one and I'm reading the other, and they both have the same theme to some extent, which is that ultimately it is because of the failure of the Iraq War, which was sold as a good war and an idealistic war, using the Second World War in many ways as the template. Thank you.
That's okay.
The template for it, because the Iraq War has ended. If it has ended as it has, people then go back and re-examine the template, and they find that it wasn't quite as it appeared to be, and it isn't. And I think that the more you examine the Second World War, which most of us ingested as myth, the more you discover what actually happened, the more disturbing it is.
Though I think it could be said that Mr. Baker's been a pacifist for a very long time. His last appearance before, well, I won't say the cameras, but in the media, was a fictionalized fantasy about the assassination of President Bush as a woman, if you remember. Now, Pat Buchanan has long been a member of the Charles Lindbergh School of politics, along with Gore Vidal, and actually quite a surprisingly large number of people whose backgrounds in America were with the America First movement. And what that means, in a sense, being officially dubious, no, not officially, dubious of the official explanation, justification of the war, that it was a response to fascist aggression, and therefore both just and necessary, and if you like, inescapable. But there have been revisionist books about this in Britain for some time. John Chalmley wrote who was amazingly professor of history at Fulton, Missouri, where the Iron Curtain speeches came, an Englishman. Long account, basically saying that the war could have been averted, or at least postponed, in some of its more grave, fell effects, softened, if it wasn't for the great gusto and enthusiasm for war displayed by Mr. Churchill, whose political career depended upon belligerence, as it had always done. I think these things have to be sayable and thinkable.
And the idea that we were discussing earlier, that Hitler needed war, he needed a nihilistic response.
Yes. Sorry, yes, there is another.
No.
Baker's given his book the extreme, actually Buchanan's choice of words is very cool, but it amounts to a very provocative title for a book. But the Nicholson title, Human Smoke, I haven't got to the stage yet where I know what he means by it. There is obviously an allusion in the book that I'm going to come to that will say why he's given this title, but obviously you can tell what people are going to think. They're going to think about the final solution, which is what most people regard as the justification, if only ex post facto, for the war. And the difficulty with that touching belief is that it's quite probable that without the cover of war, there wouldn't have been a final solution. Without the night and fog and chaos of war, it would not have been possible to embark upon the mass deportations to the east and the massacres by whichever means they were conducted that undoubtedly occurred there. So, that being the case, and with our knowledge, some of it was available at the time, that Hitler probably didn't have very many years to live. He's mentally and physically in a very advanced state of decomposition by 1940. That any time spent running out his clock and wasting his time and keeping him in balk, or in, what is the word? Well, in neutral, if you like, would have been time well spent. And there were forces in Germany who would in the end have seen sense about that. It's it's not a position one can easily or lightly dismiss. But it takes the axe to the root of the great post-war myth of our Anglo-American civilization, which was that jointly we did something grand, noble, necessary, heroic.
And as it's referred to in popular culture here, the good war.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Studs Terkel even, I mean, that's unironically called, though Studs Terkel, I'm sure at the time, would have been for the Hitler-Stalin Pact. That I'm pretty sure I remember him being for.
I think the Baker position is less interesting than the Buchanan one, because pacifism leads you to... I gather there is a statement in the book in which he describes the French capitulation in 1940 as a civilized.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
And given what followed from that capitulation, directly and predictably, I don't think that's actually a possible description. Once the war had begun, then I think it had to be fought, and certainly wasn't civilized to capitulate to people who everybody knew and had known since very early in 1933 were barbarians. This wasn't the Kaiser, this was something else.
No, it's indeed, I've just got, that's where I was at lunchtime today. I was reading this passage of praise for Philippe Pétain. He, so far, Mr. Baker, has left out the Hitler-Stalin Pact. He's included Guernica and Kristallnacht, but he's not included a lot of other pretty grim stuff. But I suppose he's going to have to deal with Vichy now, what France made of itself. And the question is really for him whether pacifism does involve a certain kind of degradation, a sense of loss of pride.
Nor do I think he included some advice which I believe Gandhi at one stage gave to the Jews of Germany, which was to commit mass suicide in protest at the way they were being treated.
Masada.
Well,
now Jonathan Schell tells me that that's not true.
I'd like to see the...
But there are some remarks that he makes that are
unbelievable.
quoted by Nicholson. There's some Gandhian piffle babble that is quoted by Nicholson that comes quite close to saying that. It comes close to advocating immolation as a means of appealing to the German conscience. Or, I better say, the Nazi conscience, to make it clear how absurd I think it is. But Jonathan Schell is a very honest guy, and I mean he's by far the most expert and scrupulous punctilious pacifist known to me. So, who's writing a book about Gandhianism in that was. Tells me that story is legend. I do think some of what Baker quotes Gandhi as saying in his own newspaper, signed articles, comes perilously close to that. It wouldn't be a huge misrepresentation, actually, of what's already said. But the numbers, you see, he says it might be that several hundreds of people have to immolate themselves to bring about the necessary shame on the part of the persecutors. He doesn't say the Jews of Germany should all kill themselves and save the Nazis the trouble. It's a narrow but deep distinction. Perhaps I could put it like that. Anyway, I mean, this argument's going to have to be had, and this generation would have had to have it without Iraq. Because the concept of the just war has to be fought over again in every epoch, in my opinion.
Thank you for those very thoughtful answers. Any other questions?
And not to say voluminous.
Hey, we want one.
Exhausting answer.
You're not a big fan of Hillary Clinton.
No.
But, is there a candidate you support?
Though I'm really not, and I took as much happy as disgusted and enraged by the terrible narcissism over Bosnia and what it conceals, which is her own role in making that such a big disaster and such a big nightmare in the first place. I hope that has completely ruled her out as even thinkable president of the United States. But if it weren't for that, I would have to say, just not out of gallantry, the way she has stood up to the sort of pasting she's got lately on it, and the sheer willingness to get up every morning and do it again, as if nothing would discourage her, is energy worthy of a better cause. I'd like to think she would have done that to save Bosnia rather than just to use Bosnia and its mass death as a means of advancing her own career. But sometimes you think it's possible to think of her caring about something other than herself. I say that very reluctantly.
Well, to use an allusion familiar to you, she is an iron lady in her own right.